I'm Kat Weissmiller, CWCB Deputy Section Chief for Water Supply Planning. I don't think we have any additional announcements this morning, but I will open it up to all the attendees to see if anybody has anything they'd like to add. All right, hearing none. I will go ahead and we can turn it over to state climatologist here to kick us off. If you're ready to go, Russ.
I am, although my Zoom all of a sudden it's being weird, but there we go. Okay.
All right, and I'm gonna make sure you have a
yep.
share. There you go. You should be good to go.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, you see it okay?
Yeah, it looks good. There's some buttons that we're seeing though. I'm not sure exactly what that's about.
At the top, just the Zoom stuff or something else?
You know what? I think it was my Zoom, I guess, maybe. I think we're good.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I will be giving the update this morning on where things stand in terms of the climate and rainfall and snow situation here across Colorado. So we'll dive right in. First, by as usual, kind of looking at where things stand for the water year to date. Up to this point, probably people have been, at least when the smoke has been out of the way, seen some thunderstorms in the last couple of weeks. So we'll begin with we're almost at the end of May now, but we'll begin with the numbers through the end of April, where we have the complete final numbers there. So this is for the water year for starting October 1st through the end of April, where things stood at that point. This is in terms of temperature. And so the map shows the rankings across Colorado, where those 7 months rank with respect to the 128-year record in terms of temperature. And it's been quite a cool start to the water year, cool first 7 months of the water year, especially by recent standards. You can see pockets of Northeast Colorado that are the top 20 coldest water year through the end of April. Also Northwest Colorado, spots through the mountains as well. Not anywhere really in the warmer than average range. So that's certainly a departure from what we've seen in the last couple of decades. So the first 7 months of the water year is a four-way tie for the 31st coldest out of 128, but the coldest start to the water year since 1984. So as we've been warming in recent decades, it's been pretty rare to see a start to the water year this cool. But in the longer term historical record, it's not that not that extreme. So if we look through the months for Colorado, we see the last 6 months were all below normal temperature. The December and January were close to normal, but we're a bit below normal, and then November, February, March, April were all cool. But as we'll see, May, that streak will break in May. So it'll be, but it's still 6 months in a row of cooler than average. Again, is quite different from anything we've seen in quite a while. Let's see. Kat, or Ben, are you still able to let people in the waiting room? I'm getting those notifications. I'm not sure if I'm the host now and I have to do that.
No, you're good. We'll keep
you got it.
On.
And then here's precipitation, similar map rankings over the 128-year record. So much of Western Colorado, like the western tier of counties, is the top 10, and then in some spots, record wettest for 7 months of the water year. Much of the rest of the state in the near normal category, and then parts of the Eastern Plains and Southeast Colorado in the drier than average category through the end of April. But we'll see these numbers have changed quite a bit with what's happened in May. But through the end of April, 46th wettest October through April, and wettest start to the water year since 2019. You can see January was the standout month of the 10th wettest, but March was wet statewide, and April was relatively dry, and then May is wet in quite a few places, but not everywhere, as we'll see. So this is just the April numbers. So this is April percent of normal. You can see the Southwest Colorado was dry in April, but this was okay. The Eastern Plains were dry in April, which was sort of a bad start to the growing season, but that's been the situation there's changed quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. And then this is from the storm at the end of April. Southeast Colorado had gotten very, very dry through March and the first part of April, but then there was a great storm in the last week of April that brought the numbers up there, and then that has continued as well. And this is water year through the end of April, percent of average. So similar to the one I showed a minute ago, very wet along the western tier of counties, and then generally dry in the southeast but again, May has changed these conditions quite a bit. If we look at our quadrant charts, this is just for April and for the statewide average. So again, if you're not familiar with these, the idea is we have precipitation along the x-axis here, and then temperature along the y. And so basically divides the chart up into 4 quadrants, where the upper left is warm and dry, so that's the drought quadrant. The upper right is warm and wet, the lower left cool and dry, the lower right cool and wet. And then the average, so the average temperature of the most recent 30-year period is this line. The longer term record is this line, which is a bit lower, of course. And then the average precipitation is the vertical line here. So April 2023 fell in the cool and dry quadrant statewide. A little bit cooler than the 20th century average, quite a bit cooler than the 30-year average. But kind of see where that sits there. And then if we look at the water year as a whole through April, again, statewide here, it falls in the cool and wet quadrant. And that's been a pretty rare quadrant to be in the last couple of decades. You can see like 2010 sits in there, there's 2019. So it's, but most of the rest of these years that we're in company with are down, are quite a long time ago that have been so cool and wet. And then if we zoom in now just to Western Colorado, so this is the climate division, that's basically everything west, everything that drains into the Colorado River. It's in the cool and really kind of, towards the very wet end of that, over that region. So you can see where that falls there through the end of April. This will moderate once the May numbers come in because it hasn't been as wet on the western slope, but certainly again, a change from what we've mostly been looking at in the last several water years, which has been up in the warm and dry. You can see 2021 there, 22, 2015, 2018, 2017, all really warm. So it stands out quite a bit, especially with respect to some of the recent years. All right, so now we'll look at May, which is, we're already more than 3 weeks in, and it's been pretty active weather-wise. So this is a departure from normal temperature for May, and you can see that most of the state has been warmer than average, with some pockets being quite a bit warmer than average, and then a few spots that are just a little bit cooler than average. So with the next week looking pretty warm, we will break that 6-month streak of below average temperature statewide in May, and will likely be, somewhere a degree or two above average, most likely when all the numbers come in statewide. And then it's in, at least for those of us here on the Front Range and the Eastern Plains, it's been wet May as well. So this is a map this is one map of month-to-date precipitation. So you can see the color scale in inches here. This is through, I should say May, not March. This is actually through Wednesday morning. And then some of the CoCoRaHS, the good CoCoRaHS observers that have all their data in for the month are shown on there as well. So we have pockets from Denver down to Colorado Springs, with a few observers with over 8 inches of rain in May so far, and pretty widespread 5 to 7 inches in May along the Front Range here, and even down into the Colorado Springs area. Parts of the Northeast Plains as well have been quite wet, although not everywhere. But you can see still mostly, 3 to 4 inches over Northeast Colorado. And then some pockets in the Southeast as well. And then last night, there was some really heavy rain around Lamar that's not incorporated into the map here. And so these numbers will go up as well. On the western slope, especially Northwest Colorado and like the Grand Junction area have been pretty dry in May. That's not too unusual. And I think that is largely a good thing, given how much snow there still is up in the mountains. So that's actually good to see a dry period to not be adding more to some of the flooding risk in that area. So again, quite wet for May. And then you can also see the drought monitor map in the background here. This was the map, the not yet updated map from today, but I'll show that a little bit later. And then just, other data sources. This is from COAGMET. This is the last 30 days. And so this captures that storm at the end of April as well in the Arkansas Valley. So pretty much everywhere in Eastern Colorado, at least a couple inches of rain in the last 30 days, with some spots with quite a lot more. Western Colorado generally drier over that period. And then this is the percent of normal precipitation over the month to date. So you can see that Front Range area, kind of Denver to Colorado Springs, over 3 times the monthly average, or the average up to this point in May, with lots of 150% of average as well. And then dry in the west, and then especially the Northwest, with a lot of places only 5 to somewhere between 5 and 50% of average. But again, that's probably better news given the big snowpack to not exacerbate flooding challenges that we've seen some of. But I think this has made it not nearly as bad as it could be if it had been a really wet May. That was the one other thing I was going to point out too here, looking at these numbers across Colorado. So the last really wet May we had statewide was 2015. And if people maybe remember, that was known as the Miracle May. It was the wettest May on record statewide in Colorado, and was known as the Miracle May because the snowpack conditions through the winter were really, really bad. And so the drought and the water supply situation was looking pretty dire, and then it turned super wet in May and kind of turned that all around. So that May was even wetter than what we've seen so far along the Front Range and in most other places. But I think it's good news that we did not get that kind of precipitation, say on the mountains and the western slope this May, because then we would have been looking at pretty bad flooding situation. Here's some stats for May of the heavy rain at Denver and Colorado Springs, which are kind of the standout ones because both we have really long records there, and they got some of the most rainfall. So this is for that May 10th through 12th period mostly. So the 2.92 at Denver on May 11th was the wettest single day since 1973, 8th wettest day overall, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, we know surrounding areas have had a lot more rain than that on a single day, but at the official observing station, still pretty impressive. The wettest single day in the Denver records is May 22nd, 1876, with 6.5 inches. And then the 3.75 over 2 days and 4.4 over 3 days. So that's the second wettest 2-day period and the third wettest 3-day period. And it's already the 6th wettest May at Denver, even if nothing else falls the rest of the month. And probably it will rain before the end of the month. And then some similar numbers at Colorado Springs. So over 3 inches on May 11th. So it's the wettest May day that they've ever had at Colorado Springs, and the 7th wettest day overall on record. And because May is not May, so climatology changes actually quite a bit as you go like from Denver northward and then Colorado Springs southwards. May is the wettest month on average for the Northern Front Range and a lot of northeastern Colorado, but that's not true in Colorado Springs. It tends not to be as wet in May there. So it's pretty unusual that both Denver and, such a wide area in both Denver and Colorado Springs had such heavy rain at the same time from the same storm. And similar, Colorado Springs already the 10th wettest May, even if no more rain falls. And that was as of yesterday. They probably got a little bit of rain last night. So we'll see where that falls there. So some pretty impressive numbers from that rain event earlier in the month. All right, so we'll quickly walk around the stations, the precipitation from the stations that we tend to show kind of going counterclockwise around the state. So we'll start at Grand Lake, and with all these graphs, just to kind of reorient you to these, the long-term average is the gray dashed line. This water year is the thick black line here up to this point. And then for going forward, all the light gray lines are all the years historically in the record at that station. And then the red and the blue are kind of representative of a year having below average accumulations from this point forward and above average accumulations from this point forward. And then green would be if we had exactly average from this point forward. So you can see at Grand Lake, actually just a little bit below average precipitation. There are some pockets, even though the snowpack in most of the mountain areas has been really, really high, way above average this winter. There are some pockets where that hasn't been true. One is kind of this area around Grand County. Another is around, Breckenridge and the South Platte headwaters, where there has not been as impressive of snow this winter, but still, this is it's not that much below average. It's 86% of average at this point in the water year. And you can kind of see where if it's average from this point forward, you end up a bit below average for the water year, but not too bad. All right, over to Grand Junction. This has moderated a bit as of early April. I think it was like in the top 5 wettest water years up to that point. It's been pretty dry since then, again, which is okay this year, but still sitting at 133% of average with the monsoon season yet to come, which tends to be relatively wet, especially on the latter half in August and September in Grand Junction. So still well above average there. Montrose, they only report their data at the end of each month, so this only goes through the end of April. But still 125% of average as of that point there. Down to Mesa Verde, way above average. You can see there 172% of average, the 4th wettest water year to date. More than 2 inches above the average for the full water year already. So even if it didn't rain anymore the rest of the year, it'd be more than 2 inches above average. But the monsoon season is yet to come, which also tends to be wet in that part of the state. So very, very healthy water conditions down in that area. Alamosa remains a little bit below average. May has been pretty good in the San Luis Valley, at least by San Luis Valley standards. You can see 1.5 to 2 inches across much of the valley in May, but it had been quite dry and windy for the March and April period leading up to that. So still a bit below average there, but again, their wettest time of the year is July, August. And so that deficit can easily be made up in the San Luis Valley. Pueblo, so this is not the current, I'll show you the current one in a second. This is what Pueblo looked like a month ago as of last week's meeting, or last month's meeting. So at that point, it was the 3rd driest water year to date, only 1.3 inches as of mid-April, 35% of average. Not looking good at that point, but here's the updated map now through late May. And you can see with that big storm at the end of April, another good storm earlier this month. This does not include the rain that fell in Pueblo last night, which was also somewhat substantial. And so we quickly went from really bad developing drought conditions to a lot closer to average. Still below average for the water year, but a lot closer now after those couple of good storms. So that's been really good to see in that part of the state in the Arkansas Valley. And then Walsh, kind of a similar story. Walsh in far southeast Colorado, as of last month's meeting, it was the 4th driest water year to date. And now after that good storm in April and a decent May, still only 69% of the average for the water year, but a lot closer than we were a month ago. And the wet season is still to come in southeast Colorado as well. Up to Burlington, they had a lot of rain in that May 10 through 12 storm as well, and now just a little bit below average after a pretty dry April. And up to Akron, which is now well above average for the water year, 136% of average. They were close to the average as of the start of May. That big storm again, May 10th through 12th or so, with I don't know, 3 to 4 inches I think they had in the Akron area over those few days, and then periodic rain since then. So looking good there. And then lastly over to Boulder, which again after a dry March and April was starting to lag behind, but then all the rain earlier in May has bumped Boulder up to above average at this point for the water year. So those are kind of our tour around the key stations around the state. All right, well, let's take a look at where things stand in terms of the drought conditions then. This photo is from, we had our annual WERA conference last week, which is related to COCORAs and volunteer precipitation measurements. We always go up to Bear Lake. So there's the Bear Lake Snowtell last Tuesday, which it was at 13.1 inches of SWE, close to the median when I took the picture, but now it's down to 8.1 after a pretty warm week. And there's some of our conference attendees there in the background. You can see. Don't worry, Brian and Carl, we didn't go and mess with any of the data. All right, so here's the latest U.S. Drought Monitor map that just rolled out this morning. And you can see, well, I'll just show, so you kind of take a look here, and then I'll just for some perspective, I'll show what it looked like a year ago at this time. And so it's quite a stark contrast there across most of the Western US, right? So last year at this time, still major drought throughout the Southwest, parts of the Southern Plains. Over half of the continental US was in drought a year ago, with 21% in D3 and D4. And today it's only 19% of the CONUS in drought and 3.7% in the D3, D4, which is mostly in Kansas and Nebraska. There's been quite a bit of relief in Texas, not as much across Kansas and Nebraska yet, but it looks like, you know, they're getting some rain now. Hopefully we'll still continue to see some relief there. All right. And so here's zooming in on Colorado then. This is, again, the map that just came out this morning, and more improvements on the map from last week after some additional heavy rain in parts of eastern Colorado last week and earlier this week. So again, we can look at these numbers. You know, as of the start of the water year, almost half of Colorado was in drought conditions. This week, less than 8%. You know, 15% of the state was in D2 as of the start of the water year. Now it's only 2.5%, and it's really limited to the far southeast corner. With some still lingering, short term has been quite wet in northeast Colorado, but the deficits that built up, like up in Sedgwick and Phillips County last summer, were so huge that those have not been made up yet. So this is long term drought, not short term, up in the northeast. Kind of a mix in this area. Like Lincoln County has missed out on some of the heavier rains in the storms earlier in May. They got quite a bit of rain there last night, so we'll evaluate that next week. And then still some long-term deficits in southeast Colorado, as you saw from Walsh, right? They've had good rain recently, but still only 70% of average or so for the water year. So still some deficits to make up there. And then this is the pocket I mentioned earlier where the snowpack was not nearly as good as basically everywhere else in the mountains. So some lingering D0 in the headwaters of the Arkansas and the South Platte kind of region. Looking at the change maps, this is over the last 4 weeks. So you can see places in widespread improvement in eastern Colorado, 2 category improvements on most of the Front Range, 3 and even 4 category improvements down in the Pueblo Canyon City area after that great storm at the end of April, and then the rain so far in May, and 2 category improvements along much of the Eastern Plains as well. So good. Quite a nice shift from what we had a month ago when we would have looked at these. And this is since the start of the water year. So again, this is where then the improvements in Western Colorado show up, from all the snow in January, February, March, and the snow in the Northeast that improved conditions there. But degradation since the start of the water year in southeast Colorado, where the fall was dry and the spring has been okay, but not as good as most other places. So kind of in the contrast then to the drought, obviously we've been talking about flooding in the state as well over the last month or so. And I'm sure Kevin Hauk will have some insights into this, probably more than I have, but here's the current map, or this is from last night, but the forecast flood map for the Grand Junction forecast area. So basically anywhere you see yellow here, the rivers are either in or expected to be near flood state. They're either near flood stage now or expected to be sometime in the next week. And so you can see along the Yampa and some of its tributaries, where that's kind of been a constant theme for the last month or so, of being near flood stage or minor flooding. Some other pockets of minor flooding and near flood stage. So nothing major at this point, which has been really good to see. We haven't seen any huge issues, but certainly there have been flooding issues around the state that we've seen over the last few weeks. But I think the fact that it's been relatively dry, not excessively warm, has been good, and the snow melt has been pretty well behaved, as we like to see. And I'm sure the NRCS report will get into more detail with that as well. So there's just a few of the flood gauges where it's been kind of lingering in that near flood stage, but fortunately not getting much worse. So this is the Gunnison near Grand Junction, has been in that action stage above 10 feet and projected to stay there for a while, but not anything worse than that. The Mancos is similar, has been, kind of in that action to minor flood stage. The Dolores, which I don't have shown here, has been similar, although I think it's been worse on the Utah side on the Dolores, downstream of further downstream of McPhee. And then the Elk River has been one that has been in flood for quite some time, and you can see the daily cycle of coming up during the day and after the melt, and then coming down and so on. Or I guess coming up like in the night after the snow melts during the day, and fluctuating there. So in that minor flood stage and getting close to the moderate flood stages at times as well. Evaporative demand is not something we've had to worry too much about, at least not over the last few weeks. This is for the last month. And most of eastern Colorado with below average evaporative demand, some slightly above average in the mountainous areas, but not too bad. So this is also good in keeping the snow melt at a healthy pace, but not not all going at once. And not losing too much to sublimation either. All right, so we started updating these maps. So this is not today's map. This is the map from the first one that Peter made in early May. And you can see that as of that time, sorry, I'm just gonna get rid of a couple of things on my own screen here. as of that time, May 5th, you can see, so this is the water balance that considers since April 1st. So using that as the start of the growing season. So you can see the effects of that warm, dry April and windy April across the Eastern Plains. You can see like Holyoke, Yuma, Kirk, we're all at the 2nd percentile, basically record low in terms of the combination of evaporative demand and precipitation as of May 5th. But that situation has clearly turned around in a big way since then. So this was the map on May 5th. Here is the map as of earlier this week. And you can see that, you know, Holyoke went from the 2nd percentile up to the 79th, way above average. Yuma and Kirk similarly back in the above average range. And then, you know, we see greens almost everywhere in Eastern Colorado with both lower evaporative demand because it's been cloudy and humid, and then also all the rain that's fallen. And then in Western Colorado and the valley areas, generally in the near average range with a couple in the, you know, tending a bit towards dry, but this doesn't consider snowpack or anything that happened before April 1st. So we know those areas have been very wet over that time period as well. And so it's just to show this at Holyoke, the individual components. This is evaporative demand, which was, so black here is the long-term average. This year is the blue, and then the record high and low are in the red and green. So we're running high. We were running high for evaporative demand as of earlier in May, but that's now a little bit below average. Precipitation was record dry for April and early May, but has now jumped up to near record high at Holyoke. And then, so the water balance, which was running record low for the April and the first half of May, or the first week of May, is now up above average for these conditions. So just a huge beneficial change to the conditions in Eastern Colorado over the last few weeks. This is a little bit old now. This was from May 1st, but I'm guessing when the June 1st ones come out, it won't look too different. Basically for Colorado, this is the wildfire potential outlook, which is in the near average range for June, and looks similar if you look further out into the summer as well. So it's yeah, not a strong signal either way, I guess, for wildfire conditions. Probably because, I mean, we have all the snowpack up there, and that's certainly going to limit any fire potential in the early part of the summer. But if we were to go into a hot, dry period, we know that things can turn around and support fires if something like that were to happen. Soil moisture, generally looking good. So these maps only show the dry side of things. I'll show the wet side in a minute. Really, the only issues are continue to be in southeast Colorado, like in Baca County, where conditions have improved certainly over the last month, but are still pretty dry going back to the really dry fall. But otherwise, you know, pretty good. And so these numbers kind of take a little bit with a grain of salt. There were some issues with these, basically every product that's based on this NOAA data set through the winter that had a bug related to the snowpack, or to this like snow cover on the Eastern Plains. And anyway, the issues have been fixed now, but it's possible that like some of these things in Northwest Colorado, because we know they've had a ton of precip up there, this may be not totally accurate depiction up there. Here's the same map, but it shows the dry side or the wet side as well. So the blues are where soil moisture is above average, and then the browns are where it's below average. So you can see the swath of where all the rain fell earlier in May has really boosted the soil moisture conditions in those areas. So generally looking good there. And I know the NRCS presentation will get into the reservoirs, but I just wanted to show there's one set of graphs that we have on our website that show kind of the contrast of what we're looking at within Colorado. So Blue Mesa, for example, is now up to close to where it would be on average at this point in the spring. And we know that it's been releasing water, and there's a lot more yet to come. So that's going to end up in, you know, certainly in the near average range, if not, you know, filling up completely by you know, over the next month. But then we look at Powell, for example, which we're now seeing the big inflows coming into Powell. but you can see we've, only just gotten ahead of where we were at the peak last spring and summer. That's going to continue to go up, but it's a long way to go. That's, that's still a deficit of what's 8 million acre feet or so below even the average conditions over the last few decades, let alone being up in the higher range. So within Colorado, looking good, but the big picture in the Colorado River Basin is still quite tenuous. All right, so let's see where we're looking with the outlook. I still have the ski thing in here, even though the ski resorts are almost all closed down now. 7-day precipitation forecast from NOAA. So this goes through next Thursday morning. Continued chances for precipitation, especially in the Northeast, and probably in the Southeast corner as well, over the next week. And we'll look at the details of this in a second. So kind of good to see that there. Continued generally pretty dry on the western slope over the next week, which again, I think is probably good news and is pretty typical. This is dry season on the western slope. So it's not unusual to see it be dry in early June. And then this is where that looks with respect to average. So projected a bit above average rainfall over the next week from the Front Range up into the northeastern plains, and in southeastern Colorado, relatively dry along the west slope. But again, the average is pretty low at this time of year out there as well. And then we'll look out then beyond that, the 8 to 14 day outlook. So this is for the first week of June. And temperature wise, the signal is not very strong there. Continued warmer than average to the north and cooler than average to the south, but kind of near normal in Colorado. But you can see this pretty strong signal for above average precipitation across much of the West for that first week of June. And this means two different things, I think, depending on where you are in Colorado. So let's look at the average conditions for June. So this is basically, is June typically a wet month or a dry month? So southwestern Colorado and most of western Colorado, June tends to be pretty dry, kind of coming out of the snow accumulation season and then before the monsoon sets in. Like in southwestern Colorado, June tends to be the driest month of the year. Whereas eastern Colorado, June, in far northeast Colorado, it's the wettest month. For most of the rest of eastern Colorado, it's like the second or third wettest month. So we expect to get quite a bit of precipitation there. So if we go back and look at this outlook for the 8 to 14 days, if you're concerned about western Colorado, above average may not mean all that much here, because the average, over a week in early June is probably less than a quarter inch. And so, if you get a half an inch, that's way above average for early June. So don't be too alarmed, I think, in western Colorado here to see above average, just because the average is very low. So really any rain is going to make you probably above average during that time. I think the place maybe to be more concerned is eastern Colorado, where it's been wet recently and where June is wet on average. So above average for early June is quite a bit of rain. And I think that's where, if we're concerned about flooding, that would be the period to be potentially concerned about. And so this is model forecasts of a parameter called precipitable water. It's basically just add up all the water vapor in the column, above you. And so this is in millimeters. So 25 millimeters is about an inch. And then the average conditions for Denver are this solid gray line here. And so we see that first week of June or so from, roughly, here's the 1st of June through, the 7th or 8th. We're seeing the kind of the daily moisture in the atmosphere being well above average and even above like the 90th percentile pretty much every day through there. And so when we get that much moisture for that prolonged of a time, there's going to be heavy rain somewhere. So too early to say, where and exactly when, but I think it'll be a time period to watch, because if we have, above average moisture for a long period of time, there's probably going to be heavy rain and at least, localized flooding, if not more than that, on the Front Range and Eastern Plains during that period. Also, Friday, tomorrow is, maybe even today, but especially tomorrow, risk for heavy rain as well across the Eastern Plains again. So that's kind of a look at that there. All right, so now finishing up, looking out to the longer range, we will be in El Nino before long. It's not clear exactly when it will be officially called, but it won't be too far from now, I think, once we get later in the summer. And there's really high confidence in El Nino persisting into next winter. So that's greater than 90% chance of El Nino persisting all the way into next winter. And then these are the individual model projections. So the magnitude of the El Nino is still uncertain, but basically every model says that it's going to be there. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And it's a pretty rapid transition occurring as well. And so that will be interesting to see how that affects our conditions as we get further out into kind of into the later in the summer and in the fall. El Nino is not going to be having a direct influence right away because it takes a while for those influences to develop. And just as a reminder, this is what the correlation is between El Nino or La Nina and seasonal precipitation. We probably show this every month, but this is winter, spring, summer, fall. If you see red, it's where El Nino tends to be wetter. And so you can see summers, Front Range, Eastern Colorado tend to be wet during El Nino. Not clear whether the El Nino signal will be fully there by this summer, but by the fall, I think that's where we'll definitely see. This is the month with the strongest correlation generally of El Nino being wetter. So I think that if anything, a wet fall is probably a good bet. And then winter is mixed, where in a lot of the mountain areas, La Ninas are actually wetter in the winter on average. But again, these signals in Colorado only tell us so much. These aren't especially strong signals either, but something to watch out for. And I think we have to be at least vigilant regarding the flood threat this summer, since we've had a wet spring. La Nina summers do tend to be or El Nino summers do tend to be when we get some of our heavier rains in Eastern Colorado. So no guarantee of that happening, but something we always kind of have to be paying attention to, especially since we've been really focused so much on drought the last several years. Got to get our minds back into the flooding mode. Here's the summer outlook from NOAA for temperature. Shows tilt towards warmer than average conditions, especially the further south and west you go. Not as strong of a signal over northeastern Colorado, but I put the dot here at Durango so you can see very little chance of a cooler than average summer with a enhanced chance of a warmer than average summer there. And then for precipitation, not all that much signal across the state, or not much confidence. Other than that, I think the general expectation is the monsoon season is expected to be not as active as it was last year or the year before. Generally, when the plains are wet, then the monsoon is weaker. But still, that's not a real high confidence forecast either at this point. But that's kind of what the outlooks seem to be showing. All right, so wrapping up. We've had 6 months in a row of below average temperatures, but this month we'll break that streak. May has been wet in eastern Colorado, relieving worries about worsening drought after the spring got off to a pretty dry start. But that's been, at least for now, has been relieved. Drought coverage down to less than 8% of the state now, compared to nearly 90% a year ago, and 45% at the start of the water year. The reservoirs are coming up. We'll hear more about that after this. Still lots of snow up at the high elevations, but fortunately not major flooding up to this point. Certainly some disruption and issues, but nothing hugely impactful. El Nino likely to emerge soon, possibly rapidly, and remain into next winter. Precip outlook for summer is uncertain, but El Nino falls tend to be wet, so that's probably one we can be a little bit more confident about. I did want to highlight this since probably everyone who's on this call is involved in climate data or interested in climate data in some way. We're sponsoring this Colorado Climate Services Summit on August 8th and 9th. I'll put the link in the chat after I'm done here. But save the date. We'll have more details coming out soon. But please join us. We were originally planning to do this in September of 2020, and then of course that got derailed. So we're finally bringing it back. And there's contact info and all that, and happy to take any questions. So thanks for having me and our report as always.
Thanks so much, Russ. That was pretty nice, good news as far as getting on a drought. So thank you for that update. I'll just pause for a second to see if there are any questions.
Russ, this is Kevin. I've got a couple of questions for you. Great presentation as always. I appreciate all the information that you give us every month. So, you know, in my world, on years like this, I always worry about the sudden warm-ups, and it seems like we haven't had any. It seems like it's been reliably warm, but not hot. And do you expect that to continue, or do you think this is about to break anytime soon? That's my first question. And then my second question is, with all this wildfire smoke, do you think we've kind of just had a bad week around here, or do you think this is kind of how this entire summer is looking to go?
Yeah, the first one's probably easier to answer. No, there's not any major heat waves or anything in the outlook, and that first week of June looks to be cooler, you know, at least relative to average through that period. So yeah, no big, you know, heat waves, at least not over the next week or two. And so that, you know, I think will continue to be good news, and you know, and probably every day we'll have chances for showers and cloudiness, which always helps too to keep the temperatures right, not cool, but not excessively warm either. Yeah, I imagine on the fires, I imagine that the pattern has been very warm up there in Canada and not very rainy, and you know, I imagine the fires up there are probably going to be burning for a very long time, and you know, so that's all that smoke's coming from very far away. It's way up in Alberta. But I would imagine we probably will have, you know, I don't think we're going to have smoke every day the whole summer or anything like that, but there probably will be periodic intrusions of that smoke as you know, when the winds come out of the northwest and come down this way, which happens, you know, pretty regularly, that's going to bring smoke with it, unfortunately. So yeah, I don't have a real high confidence forecast of exactly what that's going to look like, but it's probably, there's not a sign that those fires are going to go out anytime soon up there, because it continues to be warm, and I think they're in areas that can't really fight the fires either, and there's so many of them.
Do you think that smoke, when it does appear, does it impact weather here, or is it just kind of an unpleasant nuisance and things?
Yeah, I mean, it can keep the temperature down a little bit during the daytime. That's probably the biggest thing. But then mostly, right, then it's just ugly, and obviously the poor air quality can be bad for vulnerable groups. So that's no good either.
Thanks, Russ.
But I don't think it has like major influences on the weather here, other than, you know, maybe keeping the daytime high a degree or two cooler than it would be otherwise.
Hey Russ, this is Robert Sakata.
Hey Robert.
Great presentation. I love the moisture graph too, that all the lines. Anyway, you know, all the moisture that we've been getting in Northeast Colorado, especially this Front Range area, has been a blessing, but also for us farmers, it's creating some problems that we're having to really change our cropping plan, because I think growing degree days at my Coag station, I'm almost approaching 100 accumulated growing degree days behind already, and then just the we're already looking at changing varieties and changing crops because we're just running out of time and getting planted so late. Is there any association with El Nino as far as freeze date? You know, because that's our concern is, are we going to have enough time for the crop to grow this fall?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to look. I'm not sure off the top of my head. There probably is, but I'm not sure what it is off the top of my head. So I'll have to take a closer look into that for you. I mean, I think I would imagine, I haven't looked closely at those numbers. I imagine for May it's been a bit better, but probably you had a late start because March and April were so cool.
Yep, exactly. So cool. And now we just weren't able to get any crops in the ground, and we're still trying to get things planted, and pretty cool and wet.
Yeah, and the rain chances are going to continue to be there for that kind of, pretty much every day for the next couple of weeks probably. So I mean, hopefully these nice sunny mornings are good, but yeah.
And we've already had severe hailstorms which have taken out.
Oh no, yeah, that's no good either. Yeah, and that risk is gonna be, we're approaching first week of June. Last week of May, first week of June is kind of peak hail season around here too. So I mean, and that of course can happen all the way through into the fall, but
okay, thanks, Russ.
so I'm glad you've got water, but I realize it's not you need more than just that.
All right, any other questions for Russ? All right, I'll turn it over to Carl. Looks like he's already sharing his screen. Thanks, Carl.
Yep, no problem. Yeah, thanks, Kat. Thanks, Russ. Yeah, definitely an action time of year in the snow hydrology world. Certainly, kind of per usual, we'll see a fair amount of overlap with some of the things that Russ discussed here. But yeah, I'll go ahead and just kind of dive on in per usual with kind of a tour around our major basins. There's definitely a number of considerations when we're looking at the data this time of year, particularly with respect to snowpack data, snowpack percent of median or percent of normal as I'll refer to it as. So you'll probably hear me touch base on kind of the importance of looking at that data in a number of different ways as we go through. But yep, I will go ahead and just dive right in. So per usual, we'll start up in Northwest Colorado, kind of in the combined Yampa White basins, as well as the North Platte. So this month I decided snowpack wise for most basins to actually display our sub-basin summaries here to break things down on a little bit more of a fine scale. We can see right up in the main stem Yampa headwaters, little bit less snowpack as of right now, a bit more down in the White, a bit more up in the Little Snake, and in the North Platte, pretty near normal values. And I'll just take a second here to kind of touch base a little bit more on what I was saying when looking at the percent of normal values. This time of year, I would certainly strongly encourage folks to utilize not only the maps we produce like that, but definitely critically important to also be looking at these time series graphs to kind of hash apart what that percent of normal means, both relative to the normal value and relative to what has happened earlier in the water year, going back to October 1st. Because sometimes this time of year, extravagantly high or extravagantly below numbers can be just as much an artifact of timing as opposed to magnitude. So yeah, just certainly encourage people to look at all the data sources available, compare to water year precip, because sometimes even just a couple weeks difference in timing can give a kind of a misleading view of what the actual snowpack is. So certainly strongly encourage people to look at some different products, different data resources with respect to snowpack. But currently in the Yampa White Little Snake, sitting at 144% of median. quite a bit. It looks like a bit more than half of the snowpack at those 20 stations has melted out. I'll touch base on kind of statewide numbers on where we're sitting out with melt out relative to each site's normal peak. Over in the Laramie and North Platte, currently sitting very near the median value. But again, if you take a look back, you can see that the actual peak was quite a bit higher than normal, even though we're right at 104% of median right now. Taking a look at the water year to date precip, currently 116% median. It's been holding it well above median values since about mid-December. Dried out a bit recently over the last month in that part of the state, but still some pretty strong water year numbers so far. A little bit less in the Laramie and North Platte basins, currently at 106% of normal, really with a pretty similar temporal pattern throughout the year. You will see a bit more of an increase in May, kind of picked up some more of that moisture that's been sitting along the Front Range that has not been picked up further west in the state over the last month or so. Going into reservoir storage, not a ton of volume up there, but you can see Stagecoach Reservoir is a pretty big one up there, sitting above normal. Yamcolo slightly below 80% of normal, and then High Savory Reservoir a bit less than that. Going into our long-term time series to kind of put things into context. Again, you can see our last big peak here around 2019. Then with several dry years on the western slope kind of drying out. And we can see one big bump here over the last month. Bearing in mind these values are for May 1st. So really across the entirety of the western slope in particular, I will anticipate these June 1st numbers jumping up quite a bit more. Russ shared some great graphs there, and I was spot checking just a handful of western slope reservoirs out of curiosity, and we were certainly seeing some pretty skyrocketing values, certainly at Blue Mesa, McPhee, and a number of others, which is great to see with the Gunnison and our combined Southwest basins holding the least. But yeah, just a quick plug that these values are from over 3 weeks ago now, and we really have been seeing some pretty impressive volumes coming down the rivers since May 1st. So taking a look at our stream flow forecasts, all of these are going to be referencing May through July, with the exception of the Rio Grande and possibly the Arkansas. We'll take a look when we get there. But these volumetric forecasts, I did exclude the observed April value, just looking at May going forward. But really substantial volumes coming down from the primary snowmelt season. Yampa at Maybell, 167% of normal. Some of the basins coming down a bit further from the north, like the Little Snake, a little over 200%. Elkhead Creek, 224%. Elk River is just 150%. And then down here, the entirety of the White, or the White at Meeker rather, really substantial volumes for that May-July period, 178% of normal. And as Russ touched on as well, a lot of this did observe pretty significant April flows. I've got one slide towards the end taking a look at that, but I know down here in Hayden already experienced some very significant flooding in town. And I know over the last previous few meetings that have been touched on a bit that we were observing higher than normal low elevation snow in particular. And I think that has been certainly shown in some of the flooding we saw around Hayden. Some of the flooding we've seen down on the Dolores so far is a pretty strong pulse resulting from some of that lower elevation snowpack melting early. So moving down into the Colorado River Basin, taking a look at our current snowpacks by sub-basin. way up in the main stem headwaters, as well as the blue, pretty near normal higher up. Then kind of hit or miss, the Eagle at 60% of normal, but again, I really encourage you to take a look at your local area, take a look at the time series graph, because some of these snapshot numbers don't necessarily tell the entire picture, with a lot of it being due to timing. Another thing I will note with respect to our snowpack numbers right now is when we're looking at the percent of normal, in a lot of basins right now, sites are being excluded from the calculation because their median value has reached 0. So it can't necessarily be included. So a lot of these sites that don't have a value in them doesn't necessarily mean there's no snow. It could mean that the actual median is 0. So you can see these ones, the circle with the vertical line means the median is 0. So just one more thing to keep in mind. We'll give a plug for the Grand Mesa area down here. This is represented as Plateau Creek in the Colorado, but there definitely still is very substantial snowpack up on top of the Grand Mesa. I just took a look at our Park Reservoir site, which is this one here. Still very significant amounts of snow water equivalent. So both from a water supply standpoint, but particular flooding, something to keep an eye on. There's already been a pretty impressive amount of water coming down the North Fork of the Gunnison, and still plenty more snow up there to melt. So here's our time series for the greater Upper Colorado, 138% of normal snow water equivalent as a whole. You can see the peak was quite a bit above normal. Currently the melt out curve is maybe a week or so later than normal, but not terribly so. And the later we get into the season, certainly we're going to be experiencing higher solar angles, higher daily temperatures potentially. So we can certainly anticipate some of these quick snow melt rates to continue. As far as water year to date precipitation is concerned, currently 109% of normal across the entirety of the Colorado headwaters, as measured at SNOTEL sites, as is the case with all of these things I'm presenting. Taking a look at reservoirs, kind of a smattering. It looks like this, again, is not every single reservoir. This is just kind of a snapshot of some of the reservoirs in the Colorado headwaters. Looks like Green Mountain, Granby, and Willow Creek Reservoir, all above normal. One thing that'll, I imagine, will be of interest to note for some folks interested in the effects of fire scars, certainly flooding this year or in other contexts, is I didn't put a slide in it about it, but Willow Creek, coming out of the East Troublesome fire area, observed nearly 200% of normal April runoff, total volume throughout the month of April, where pretty much all the surrounding stream gauges in the area were right around 100% of normal. So that one really jumped out with respect to the impact of that fire scar on certainly the timing of snowmelt runoff, with that early snowmelt really hitting hard in Willow Creek within that East Troublesome fire scar. Taking a look at our long-term reservoir storages. Again, this graph showing a volumetric departure from median here. Really has maintained pretty steady values throughout the last water year, after the last major peak in 2019 and drying out and coming back up. But the last water year or so, some slight increases, but not a ton of major changes in reservoir storage. Going into our May through July volumetric forecasts, fair amount of range within this. We can kind of see Some of our lower forecasts here on the Blue River, Dillon Reservoir inflow on the low end at just 80% of normal May through July volumes. Certainly a bit more up north. Roaring Fork at Glenwood right before the confluence. Pretty solid volumes coming out of there at 132%. Then kind of this major point downstream as we get closer to Grand Junction at 118% of normal. And then with rather significant flows coming out of the Gunnison, we are sending pretty significant amounts of water downstream. I know the Colorado just downstream of Grand Junction as it goes into Utah was flowing up around 36,000 CFS last weekend. With some, I can speak from experience, some flooded campsites and really, really impressive water down there on the lower Colorado as it headed into Utah. So over into the Front Range, quick snapshot at how our sub-basin snowpack is looking. Largely following a similar pattern. You can see some of these kind of three northernmost basins, North Fork, Poudre, Main Stem Poudre, Big Thompson, still holding some of the higher snowpack values. Clear Creek is doing pretty good. Throughout the water year, the upper South Platte had been on the low end. I know the Arkansas actually did pick up some additional snow towards the latter part of April. And certainly some of that could have been picked up at South Platte, at these Main Stem South Platte SNOTEL sites. But again, I can't hammer home enough. Certainly encourage folks to look at all our data points available. Look at the time series graphs, look at your water year precipitation, make sure you're really getting the best picture of how much snow there was and how much remains in the context of this year as well as relative to normal. But looking at our time series graph, really across the entirety of the South Platte, snowpack remained at pretty close to normal levels really throughout the entire curve, including timing of this final peak. And here we are at the ablation season, reading 89% of normal, but really pretty close to that median value. Water year to date precip throughout the last several months, excuse me, it's been holding just at barely below normal precipitation values. We can see kind of a bit of an increase here within the last 2 to 3 weeks as a result of some of that precipitation that's been hitting the Front Range. Yeah, to get it back up to its current value at 96% of normal. Kind of a snapshot of a lot of the major reservoirs in the South Platte. Some of the standouts here, Gross Reservoir up above Boulder, Black Hollow. We've got some on the low end still, like Loveland, Union, Boyd Lake, but for the most part, quite a majority of these are in range of normal, slightly below normal reservoir storages. So nothing too dramatic to report on there, which is generally a good place to be. So we can see throughout this most recent water year, had a slight drop and then increasing over the coming months. And even with stream flow forecasts being on the lower end, at least relative to what we're seeing on the western slope, certainly can anticipate at our next report, once that data comes in for June 1st, for those storage values to be right up, pretty likely closer to normal. Going into our water volumetric water supply forecasts, this certainly paints a picture more similar to what we've been seeing throughout the water year, whereas the current snowpack values were a little jumpier, but generally a pretty solid north to south trend with some of the main stem headwaters and other southern subbasins anticipating on the lower end of the seasonal volumetric runoff spectrum. And then as we get further up north into the Big Thompson and the Poudre, with those being forecasted to have slightly above normal volumetric runoff for the May, June, July period. So back over into Western Colorado, moving into the Gunnison. So we can see here, here's our current snowpack. Looking at a sub-basin scale, definitely tell still very substantial snowpacks holding on all around. Here's kind of the main stem, Upper Gunnison area. Kind of looking at, this is primarily looking at all the way from the headwaters through the confluence with the North Fork of the Gunnison here, naturally in the North Fork Valley. As I mentioned previously, even if you look at the individual site data up here on the Grand Mesa, still some really impressive snow water equivalent depths at these SNOTEL sites, with just the Uncompahgre being a bit on the low end relative to the rest of the Gunnison, but still maintaining 155% of normal SWE is nothing to sneeze at, and certainly a quite a dramatic shift over what we've seen for the previous 3 years. So basin wide, currently reporting at 248% of normal snowpack. But again, that's kind of, you know, comparing to a value about here on the curve. It's definitely important to look at what the peak value was, kind of the effect of timing versus magnitude. But still rather impressive snowpack. Hit a point here, looks like in late March, where it was nearly a record. But near peak was probably in range of about the 95th percentile. So very impressive accumulations, and we can see a pretty steep melt curve since just the last week in April there. With respect to water year-to-date precipitation, currently 131% of normal, just below our 90th percentile kind of shift in shading there from the blue to the purple. So call that maybe 85th to 90th percentile as far as water year-to-date precipitation at SNOTEL sites in the Gunnison. We won't dwell on this too much throughout the entire water year and really the last couple years. The Gunnison, as well as our combined Southwest basins, have had by far the lowest reservoir storages. But this is changing very quickly, as we can see. Really a pretty steady gain throughout this current water year here. This is the gain from April to May 1st. And I will certainly anticipate when we get to June 1st, these values to have jumped up quite a bit more. It's really impressive. You know, looking at some of the ones I noted, Blue Mesa as well as McPhee were two that I checked that really jumped out at me as having just skyrocketing values on a daily basis, which is encouraging to see. Looking at our volumetric forecasts, you know, as one would expect with some of the things we've been mentioning with snowpack, we can see the North Fork of the Gunnison at Somerset forecasted for nearly 200% of normal May through July volume. Surface Creek at Cedar Edge coming off of the Grand Mesa there at 248%. So certainly indicating, even though these are for May 1st and we've been seeing a lot of volume coming down, I would certainly anticipate lots more volume still coming out of the North Fork Valley into the Gunnison there and confluencing on down to the Gunnison at Grand Junction, which again, especially for a major pour point like this, to see 170% of normal total volume over a 3-month period is really certainly something to take note of. Again, some of these on the lower end with the Uncompahgre at Kelowna, 137%, Taylor Taylor River below Taylor Park, 125%. But again, don't let these lower numbers relative to the really big ones be too much of a distraction, because really strong flows coming out of much of the Gunnison Basin. So moving on into our combined basins of Southwest Colorado, the San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan basins. I will note here, the Dolores is not populated, kind of due to how the calculations are, as I noted, with some of the median values being at 0 and things like that. It didn't fill in the basin, but I can assure you the Dolores is certainly well within range of some of these other ones. Will likely be sitting even a bit higher, as it had the biggest snowpack in the state relative to normal anywhere in that subbasin. But Animas still has 255% of normal, Mancos La Plata 230, San Miguel 202. A bit lower here in the main stem upper San Juan, but still far from anything to sneeze at 147% of normal snowpack. As you can see across really the entirety of that far southwest corner of Colorado, did get into record territory for a brief period there, and really got extremely close to an all-time record peak in these combined basins. Really quite impressive, and that is most certainly being reflected in the streamflow volumes we're seeing now and can anticipate to see for a couple months to come. So currently 258% of normal. Again, really important to look at the big picture, because during this meltout season, that aspect of timing can certainly impact it. But it looks like we've had about 2/3 of this peak snowpack that existed has melted out, as measured at SNOTEL sites, but certainly on a pretty steep curve since that last week in April. Looking at water year precipitation, rather similar to the snowpack, where we did see precip get up into record territory for a brief period there. Dried out over the last month or so, but still residing at 132% of normal, and pretty near the 90th percentile of period of record observations. Taking a look at reservoirs, again, I'm gonna kind of just buzz through this and mostly focus on the note that they are going up quickly. We can see this was certainly observed from April 1st to May 1st, and without question, we'll anticipate these reservoir values to be up quite a bit higher when those numbers come in here in another week or so. Going on into our May through July volumetric forecasts, still looking at very impressive numbers. Not surprisingly, the Dolores here on the high end, with these couple of forecasts in the right around 200% of normal and above. So has really been some phenomenal volumes coming down the Dolores. The early season stuff was even more than myself and I think a lot of folks would anticipate, similar to, like I noted, with the flooding around Hayden, really across Western Colorado, even as measured at SNOTEL sites, we were seeing well above normal SWE values at some of the lower elevations. And I think that has been driving really a lot of the natural flows in the Dolores. But Animas at Durango forecast for 154% of normal volumes. San Juan at Caracas, 143% of normal. So over into the upper Rio Grande Basin, didn't do the sub-basin breakdown here, due to, you can see most of these sites over in the Sangre de Cristos have this vertical line through them, indicating that the median value for snowpack is 0, so it kind of hinders some of these standard central tendency measurements we compare to. But really throughout the year, the entirety of the Sangres did hold some of the lower snowpacks in the state, which is a pretty stark contrast to the western side of the Rio Grande, coming out of the eastern San Juan Mountains. But as a whole, still sitting at 177% of normal snowpack. We can see here, actually in early March was residing pretty near normal. Then throughout March brought a ton of precipitation to the Rio Grande, and then have seen that relatively swift decline ever since then. Again, it looks like more than probably at about or less than 30% of what the peak value was this year. So still some snow holding on at those snow-tell sites, but starting to dwindle, certainly. Water year-to-date precipitation. Please excuse this data hiccup here. We will been seeing a variety of some funky stuff in our data and haven't had a chance to clean that up. But after it's bounced back up, this value at 106% of normal is likely right in range of where it should be. Reservoir storage in the Rio Grande has been faring quite a bit better than in the combined Southwest basins and the Gunnison, which is good to see. You can see quite a few of these individual reservoirs well above normal, good handful below. But here you can, looking at our time series, you can really see through this entire water year, overall volume across the whole basin has been above normal and holding relatively steady. Moving on to our volumetric forecasts. Again, in the Rio Grande, we're looking at April through September or May through September, excuse me, as opposed to May through July. I believe we've got that standard forecast period. I would guess something likely related to the Rio Grande Compact, which is a pretty complicated agreement there. But some of the major points here, the Rio Grande at Del Norte is forecast for 118% of normal. That's a major one with legal obligations or implications for the compact. In general, I'd have you take a look again at these big differences, what's flowing out of the west side of the basin versus what's flowing out of the east side of the basin, coming out of the Sangre de Cristos, with some pretty stark differences of anticipating substantially lower volumes in these streams coming out of the Sangres versus coming out of the western San Juans. So on into our final major basin, the Arkansas is another one that without question throughout the year, we've been really seeing some very stark differences. Again, I displayed our sub-basin map here, but we are not seeing values from like the Purgatory, Episcopa, kind of some of these southern tributaries where the median value is currently 0, but I would certainly anticipate many, if not all, of these snow-tell sites have also melted out, given that they had some of the most meager snowpacks in the state. But in stark contrast, the Arkansas headwaters, you can think of it as basically above Salida here, still at 125% of normal snowpack. Lower Arkansas headwaters, not really driven by a ton of data, necessarily not a ton of snow-tell sites representing that. Certainly less total volume as compared to the headwaters, but showing a lower value there. Here, and I will point out one down here in the Caneos and Rio San Antonio, kind of an example of from this point going forward when to be cautious of just these snapshot percent of normal values. This is showing 1,488% of normal snowpack. So once our median values get closer and closer to 0, it's easier and easier for these percent of normals to get exaggerated. So again, really important to look at some multiple resources, look at the time series graphs as you're actually using these data to make decisions. Currently sitting at pretty near normal snow water equivalent levels for this time of year. Peak ended up slightly below a total normal value. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we had a slightly below normal peak, but here at the very end of April, we did have some of those accumulations add a fair amount. Looks like maybe over an inch and a half of snow water equivalent, perhaps, at many of those SNOTEL sites. So added a little bit of bump, which certainly contributes more modeled water to the total system, kind of before we went back into our melt period with some more additional accumulations there. Total water year-to-date precipitation, currently 96% of the median value. Again, we can see that big bump here at the end of April, and then over what's probably about the last 2 weeks or so, maybe 2.5 weeks, have received some pretty significant additional precipitation, bringing those values back up in the Arkansas. Reservoir storages, kind of all over the place, looking at this snapshot of individual reservoirs, but kind of taking a step back at the bigger picture, really since the big jump in 2019 and drop, since early 2020, there's been some slight ups and downs, but reservoir storage has largely remained in a fairly constrained area for about the last 3 years in the Arkansas Basin at slightly below normal. So taking a look at our so this one is back to the May through July period, whereas with the Rio Grande, we were looking at all the way through September. But here really gives you a good idea of that north to south gradient I was talking about here, where at some of the southern tributaries were as low as 63% of normal volumes up into the 70s. Here in the Wet Mountain Valley, Great Creek near Westcliff down at 61%. And then further up north in the headwaters with Chalk Creek is a pretty significant tributary, as well as the major point of the Arkansas at Salida at 96%. And then main stem Arkansas down at Pueblo at forecast for 97% of normal volumes. So we'll just kind of take a big step back at everything we've looked at. Current snowpack on the ground, as of yesterday at least, certainly reflects the trends we've been seeing all year, as one may anticipate. Southwest Colorado, with including the Gunnison within that, certainly holding by far the most snow relative to normal amounts. Broadening that to the western slope in general, with the Colorado headwaters and the Yampa White and Little Snake basins still well above normal, followed by the Rio Grande, and then the Arkansas is currently holding near normal, but again, this is not equitably distributed amongst the greater basin, with the main stem headwaters certainly having quite a bit more snow than a lot of these southern tributaries coming out of the Sangre de Cristos. And then similarly in the South Platte, throughout the whole year, we've really seen this south to north gradient with less snowpack down here in the main stem, and a bit more plentiful up north. But can't hammer it home enough. At this time of year, it's certainly advisable to really dig into your local area, look at the time series data, to really figure out exactly what the current snow situation is and how that may be affecting water resources, flood concerns, what have you. So this one is a bit to look at a glance. So what we have here is percent of the current water year peak. And apologies, this particular slide is a lot to soak in, but I largely put it in there as a encouragement. If this is a parameter that you're interested in, this is readily available in our interactive map as something to follow. So you can basically tell relative to whatever the peak was this current year, how much of that has melted out. So as an example, just looking at some clumps here down in the Sangre de Cristos, you can see these sites essentially completely melted out. A lot of lower elevation sites melted out. Like we've got Porphyry Creek on Monarch Pass is only at 40% of what the peak was. But during this melt season, just wanted to kind of put this in here as a plug of an interesting parameter to explore of given however much snow there was at a particular snowtel site at its peak, you can tell how much of that is now left. Statewide value is showing at 137% of normal. Again, a lot of that is driven by timing as much as raw magnitude, but we can see statewide ended up with a really significant peak, probably in range of about the 95th percentile of historic observations. So statewide was really ended up being as a very substantial snowpack accumulation year. Water year to date precip, certainly seeing some more tightly clustered values here than we saw with respect to peak snowpack. The Arkansas and South Platte residing just below normal. Gunnison and our combined Southwest basins on the high end, kind of followed by Northwest Colorado, and Colorado Headwaters, Rio Grande, and the Laramie and North Platte. And so Russ touched base on a lot of the month-to-date precipitation. Again, our data is looking explicitly from snowtel sites, what we've been seeing going on in the mountains. So certainly a pretty stark shift from what we've seen throughout the rest of the water year on the winter to date, where May to date, in our mountainous areas, we've been seeing substantially less precipitation west of the continental divide compared to east of the continental divide. And here in the Rio Grande and the Arkansas, actually seeing some of our highest values. And you can note the Sangre de Cristos over the last 3.5 weeks or so, finally getting some moisture coming their way. Water year to date precipitation statewide currently at 111% of normal. So here, this is taking a step back. This is April 1st reservoir storage. And excuse me, these maps ended up with a different color ramp on them. So you can take a look at the numbers, but you can kind of see increase over from April 1st to May 1st, particularly in the Gunnison and combined Southwest basins. Increases of 10 to 15% of normal there. But again, with the inflows we've been seeing since May 1st, not going to dwell on these too much because certainly anticipating a lot of these numbers to substantially change in another week or so when we get the next round of data in. So looking at statewide reservoir storage. Again, this is a volumetric departure from normal. We can see this lowermost line is the combined volumetric deficit for the whole state, being largely driven by the Gunnison and combined Southwest basins. But again, throughout April, a big increase there, and would certainly anticipate even more of an increase once the data from May comes in. So taking a look, this is our April monthly observed volumetric forecasts. Certainly see, again, stark differences along the continental divide here, or I guess with the exception of the Rio Grande, it did also have above normal stream flow throughout April, with taking note of this pretty big difference between east and west within the Rio Grande. Largely driven by big snowpacks in general, but also substantial lower elevation snowpacks, putting out a lot of early season stream flow. Here's a look at our remaining forecasts for the May through July period. Still for the coming 3 months, looking at very substantial volumes in the Yampa White, Little Snake, Gunnison, as well as our combined Southwest basins. Then still above normal in the Colorado, Upper Rio Grande, and slightly below normal for the Arkansas and South Platte. So taking a look at how our SWASI has changed over the last month. This is April 1st, and to be honest, I put it in here, but not an incredibly significant change in the SWASI during that time period. Generally seeing a lot higher values across Western Colorado, as one would anticipate. So just in summary, as we're getting closer to June, any remaining snowpack at SNOTEL sites is melting rather quickly. On average, SNOTEL sites are down to about 25% of what their respective peak values were. And you know, those peak values certainly varied area to area, but whatever it was, say there was 20 inches of snow water equivalent, at sites it'd be down to 5 inches now. Water year-to-date precip is near, slightly below in some basins to well above normal across much of Colorado. May-to-date precipitation is certainly favored east of the Continental Divide, with Western Colorado finally being a bit drier. Really saw those April observed streamflow values well above normal across the western slope. I am most certainly anticipating that to be the case for May once that data comes in. Really seeing some really impressive stream flows across the western slope. And the forecasts are certainly indicating this pattern to persist with much higher streamflow volumes in Western Colorado, as opposed to things flowing south and east out of the state. And stay tuned for our next round of reservoir storage updates, particularly in Western and Southwest Colorado, where we've been seeing the biggest deficits. Those reservoir storages are going up and up by the day with these significant streamflow volumes. Yeah, and that is all I had for now, and certainly happy to take any questions if we have any time.
And we do have a bit of time if there are any questions. If not, thank you, Carl, for a great report.
Yep, no problem.
All right. And I'm not seeing too many water providers on today, but I will take a pause here and ask if any water providers are on and would be able to report out on your current conditions and how things are looking for you. Okay, well, hearing nobody jumping up to report out, I'll make a pause for any other updates from this group. And if there are none, our next meeting is June 20th. And we'll get that notice and sent out to emails. And thank you all for jumping on today.